The hardest part about judging a stranger is discovering how wrong you were after you've already built a wall between you. If someone had told me that the man who openly claimed he hated gay people would eventually become the safest place I'd ever known, I would have laughed, picked up my suitcase, and walked away before unpacking a single shirt. Instead, I signed the lease. 3 days earlier, I had lost my apartment. Not because I missed rent. Not because I had done anything wrong. My landlord sold the building with almost no warning, leaving every tenant scrambling to find somewhere else before the end of the month. Finding affordable housing in Chicago on short notice felt like competing in an Olympic event I had never trained for. Every listing disappeared within hours. Some never replied. Others demanded rent that exceeded my monthly paycheck. After 2 sleepless nights and more rejected applications than I cared to count, one advertisement remained. Private bedroom. Shared apartment. Quiet roommate preferred. The price looked almost suspiciously reasonable. His name was Noah Bennett. We exchanged only a handful of messages before arranging a meeting. He wasn't unfriendly, just brief. Every answer contained exactly the information I had asked for. Nothing extra. No smiley faces. No unnecessary conversation. Saturday afternoon, I stood outside a renovated brick building carrying 2 overstuffed suitcases and wondering whether this was a terrible idea. The apartment occupied the 3rd floor. Large windows overlooked a tree-lined street where cyclists passed beneath early autumn leaves. Inside, everything was immaculate. Dark wood furniture, books arranged perfectly along floating shelves. A spotless kitchen, the kind of place where every object seemed intentionally placed. Noah appeared from the hallway carrying a toolbox. He was taller than I expected. Broad shoulders, short dark blonde hair, blue-gray eyes that looked observant without appearing judgmental. He extended his hand. "Ryan, that's me. I'm Noah." His handshake was firm but relaxed. He gave me a quick tour without wasting words. Bathroom, laundry closet, kitchen rules, garbage schedule, guest policy. Everything felt practical, orderly, predictable. Honestly, I liked that. After showing me the spare bedroom, he leaned against the doorway. "If you decide to take the room, there are only 2 things I care about." I waited. Pay rent on time. Fair. And respect shared spaces. "I can manage both." He nodded once. "Then we're probably fine." An hour later, I signed the agreement. By Sunday evening, most of my belongings filled the bedroom. The move had gone surprisingly smoothly. I almost convinced myself I had gotten lucky. That illusion lasted until Monday night. I had just finished unpacking dishes when the apartment buzzer sounded. Noah opened the front door. A coworker stepped inside carrying takeout containers. The 2 men settled in the living room while I continued organizing boxes down the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The walls simply weren't very thick. Their conversation drifted clearly toward my room. "You finally found a roommate? Needed help with rent. Lucky you didn't end up living with some party guy." A short pause followed. Then Noah answered with complete confidence. "I had one requirement." "What?" "I wasn't living with a gay guy." The words landed harder than I expected. His coworker laughed. "You serious?" "Yeah." "Why?" "I've had enough experience to know they're nothing but trouble." Silence filled the hallway. My hand stopped folding towels. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the cardboard box in front of me. I had spent most of my adult life deciding when it felt safe to tell people the truth. Sometimes it mattered. Sometimes it didn't. Apparently, this time it definitely did. I quietly closed my bedroom door before either of them noticed I had heard everything. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. One sentence repeated inside my head. "Don't tell him. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Because for the first time in years, home didn't feel like the place where I lived. It felt like the place where I would have to hide. People rarely reveal who they truly are during an argument. They reveal themselves in the quiet moments when they believe no one is paying attention. The morning after overhearing Noah's conversation, I decided on a simple strategy. Keep my head down. Pay rent on time. Stay polite. Leave before anything became complicated. It sounded easy enough. At breakfast, Noah stood in the kitchen preparing coffee with remarkable precision. Every movement seemed carefully practiced, from weighing the beans to setting the timer on the kettle. He glanced toward me. "Coffee. I'd appreciate that." He poured a second mug without another word. "Thanks." "No problem." The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply controlled. We drank our coffee while the city slowly woke beyond the apartment windows. Cars rolled along damp streets. Cyclists hurried toward work. Someone walked a golden retriever across the park below. For a brief moment, the apartment almost felt peaceful. Then I remembered what I had heard the night before. The illusion disappeared. Over the next several days, our schedules settled into an unexpectedly smooth routine. I left around 8 each morning for the design studio. Noah departed 30 minutes earlier for his engineering office. We rarely occupied the apartment at the same time. When we did, conversations remained practical. Need anything from the grocery store? No, thanks. I'll take the trash out. I already did. Simple exchanges. Nothing personal. One Thursday evening, I returned home carrying 2 bags filled with groceries. Before I could unlock the apartment door, one paper bag split open. Apples rolled across the hallway. A carton of eggs slid toward the stairwell. I sighed. Perfect. Before I could kneel, another pair of hands calmly caught the eggs. I've got those. Noah gathered the scattered groceries with surprising efficiency. You didn't have to help. I was already here. He handed me the last apple. There. Thank you. He shrugged as though the situation required no acknowledgement. Inside the apartment, he disappeared into the kitchen while I finished putting everything away. 10 minutes later, a knock sounded against my bedroom door. When I opened it, Noah held out a small bowl. I made too much pasta. I blinked. You can have some if you want. That's kind of you. It would have gone to waste. Maybe. Or maybe that was simply easier than admitting generosity. Either way, the food smelled incredible. Thanks. He nodded once before walking away. I closed the door, completely confused. This wasn't how I imagined someone who supposedly disliked people like me. The contradictions continued. Saturday morning, I overslept after working late on a client presentation. Rushing through the apartment, I couldn't find my keys anywhere. I checked the kitchen, the couch, every jacket pocket. Nothing. I'm looking for these. I turned around. Noah stood beside the entryway, holding my keys between 2 fingers. You left them on the counter. I would have been late. I figured. Another tiny act of consideration. Another quiet gesture that refused to fit the picture I had built. That afternoon, my best friend Ethan called. How's the new roommate? Complicated. Bad. I don't know. You don't know? I lowered my voice instinctively. He told someone he hates gay people. There was a long pause. And then he makes coffee for me. What? He helps with groceries. Ryan. He cooked dinner. Ryan. He found my keys. My friend laughed in complete disbelief. Either he's the world's most confusing homophobe, or you're missing part of the story. After hanging up, I found myself replaying every interaction we'd shared. Not once had Noah insulted me. Not once had he behaved aggressively. The only evidence I had came from one conversation overheard through a hallway wall. Everything else told a different story. Late that evening, I stepped onto the apartment balcony for fresh air. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath the clear sky. A moment later, the sliding door opened behind me. Noah joined me, keeping a respectful distance. Long day. You could say that. He rested his arms against the railing. So, how are you settling in? I looked at him, searching for any trace of the man I'd heard only days earlier. So far, I answered honestly. It's different than I expected. A faint smile crossed his face. I've been thinking the same thing. Neither of us realized those words carried completely different meanings, yet somehow they marked the first small crack in the invisible wall standing between us. Sometimes the people who insist they're the strongest are quietly carrying wounds no one has ever bothered to notice. 2 weeks passed before anything truly disrupted our carefully balanced routine. By then, I had learned Noah's habits almost without realizing it. He left for work at exactly 7:30 every weekday. He watered the small collection of plants by the living room window every Sunday morning. He listened to soft jazz while preparing dinner. He never left dirty dishes in the sink. And every evening, just before going to bed, he spent 15 quiet minutes reading in the armchair beside the bookshelf. Predictable, consistent, safe. I, on the other hand, had become an expert at editing myself. Whenever coworkers mentioned dating, I changed the subject if Noah happened to be nearby. Family photos stayed inside a drawer instead of on my bedroom shelf. Even my phone remained face down whenever messages arrived from Ethan. Living with secrets required constant attention. Oddly enough, Noah never gave me a reason to feel afraid. Only uncertain. Late one Tuesday afternoon, rain followed me all the way home. By the time I reached the apartment, my clothes were soaked and an unpleasant ache had settled behind my eyes. I blamed the weather. The next morning, the headache remained. By lunchtime, my throat burned every time I swallowed. Still, I went to work. Design deadlines didn't disappear simply because my body wanted rest. That evening, I barely made it through the front door before dropping my backpack onto the floor. "You okay?" I looked up. Noah stood in the kitchen, concern replacing his usual calm expression. "Just tired." "You don't sound tired." "I'm fine." The lie fell apart halfway through the sentence as a harsh cough interrupted me. Noah frowned. "When's the last time you checked your temperature?" "I haven't." "You should." "I'll survive." He didn't argue. He simply nodded once before returning to the kitchen. I assumed that ended the conversation. An hour later, someone knocked gently on my bedroom door. "Come in." Noah stepped inside carrying a steaming bowl and a small paper bag from the pharmacy. I stopped by the drugstore after work. I stared at the medicine in disbelief. "You bought this." "You have a fever." "You don't know that." "You look like you do." He placed everything carefully on my desk. "There's soup." "You cooked." "It isn't complicated." "I can pay you back." "No need." He turned toward the door. "Take the medication after you eat." Before I could thank him again, he disappeared into the hallway. The soup tasted homemade. Simple. Comforting. Exactly what I hadn't realized I needed. Sometime during the night, I woke shivering beneath my blankets. The room felt strangely cold. When I reached for the glass of water beside the bed, it was already half full. I frowned. I couldn't remember filling it. The bedroom door stood slightly open. Outside, a faint light glowed beneath the kitchen cabinets. The apartment remained completely silent. The following morning, my fever had eased enough for me to leave my room. As I entered the kitchen, Noah stood washing his coffee mug. "You should stay home." "I feel better." "You don't look better." "I'll survive." He glanced at me over his shoulder. "You're stubborn." "So I've been told." For the first time since moving in, the corner of his mouth lifted into a genuine smile. "So have I." The moment lasted only a second before he reached for his briefcase. "I'm working late tonight." "I'll be fine." "I know." He hesitated near the front door. "If the fever comes back, text me." The apartment grew quiet after he left. My eyes wandered toward the kitchen counter. Beside the coffee maker sat another pharmacy receipt. The timestamp read 10:47 p.m. long after I had gone to bed. He hadn't stopped at the drugstore after work. He had gone back out in the middle of the night. Not because he had to, because he wanted to make sure I had what I needed. I folded the receipt slowly, unable to reconcile the kindness of the man I lived with and the harsh certainty of the words I had overheard on my very first night. For the first time, I found myself wondering if the version of Noah I feared had never actually been the real one at all. The truth rarely announces itself all at once. More often, it slips through tiny moments until one day you realize you've been looking at the wrong story from the beginning. After recovering from the fever, I couldn't stop noticing Noah. Not in the way people notice someone they're attracted to. Not yet. I noticed him because none of his actions matched the image I had created during that first week. Every assumption I carried seemed to lose another piece each day. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of quiet music drifting from the living room. Soft piano. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to accompany the sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor. When I stepped into the kitchen, Noah stood making pancakes. He glanced over his shoulder. "Morning. Morning. I made too much." I smiled. "Again?" He looked genuinely confused. "I don't know how to cook for one person." "I've noticed." He placed another plate on the table. Breakfast unfolded with surprising ease. We talked about neighborhood restaurants, favorite books, Chicago winters. His dry sense of humor surfaced more often than I expected, subtle enough that I almost missed it the first few times. For someone who claimed not to enjoy conversations, he listened remarkably well. That afternoon, we decided to reorganize the storage closet. It wasn't planned. One loose shelf collapsed, and suddenly everything was scattered across the hallway. Boxes, old blankets, holiday decorations, photo albums. While lifting another container onto the top shelf, a framed photograph slipped free and landed gently against the wall. The glass hadn't broken, but the picture had turned face up. Two teenage boys stood on a fishing dock, laughing beneath a summer sunset. One was unmistakably a younger Noah. The other looked several years older. They shared the same eyes, the same smile. My brother. Noah's voice came quietly behind me. I handed him the frame. You look alike. We used to hear that all the time. His thumb brushed absent-mindedly across the edge of the photograph. You were close. The closest. The warmth in his expression faded almost immediately. He passed away. I'm sorry. He nodded once. It was a long time ago. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked carefully, accident. He looked toward the apartment window instead of answering right away. Something like that. The conversation ended there. Not because I didn't care. Because I sensed the memory still carried weight too heavy for casual questions. Later that evening, while searching for a screwdriver inside the hall cabinet, I accidentally knocked a small notebook onto the floor. A folded newspaper clipping slipped out. Without thinking, I picked it up. Before I could read more than a headline, Noah stepped into the hallway. His expression changed instantly. Not anger. Panic. I'm sorry. I immediately handed it back. I wasn't trying to. I know. He folded the clipping quickly and returned it to the notebook. His breathing remained unusually slow, as though carefully holding something together. I shouldn't have left that there. You don't have to explain. I know. Another long silence settled between us. Then, for the first time since we'd met, Noah spoke without looking directly at me. My brother spent most of his life wishing people understood him. His voice was steady, but quieter than usual. I wasn't one of them. I waited. I thought I was protecting him. His fingers tightened around the notebook. I was wrong. Those 3 words lingered in the hallway long after he stopped speaking. He walked into his bedroom before I could respond. The door closed gently. Not slammed. Just closed. I remained standing beside the storage closet, replaying everything I'd heard. The photograph. The notebook. The regret that had crossed his face. For weeks, I had believed Noah's prejudice came from certainty. Now I wasn't so sure. It looked far more like grief. And grief, I was beginning to understand, could disguise itself as many things: silence, distance, guilt, even beliefs that no longer reflected the person quietly carrying them. A secret doesn't become heavy because it's shameful. It becomes heavy because every passing day makes you care more about the person you're hiding it from. October settled over Chicago with crisp mornings and streets painted in shades of amber and crimson. Without ever discussing it, Noah and I had developed traditions. Saturday grocery shopping. Sunday breakfast. Taking turns choosing movies neither of us actually watched because we spent more time talking than paying attention to the screen. The apartment no longer felt like borrowed space. It felt lived in. Comfortable. One Friday evening, I arrived home carrying a cardboard box from my office. Noah looked up from the dining table. What's that? My company is replacing some equipment. He opened the box. A monitor? They let employees keep the old ones. He nodded approvingly. Nice. I'll finally have 2 screens. I've heard designers love those. We do. For the next hour, we assembled the new setup together. Noah handled the cables with effortless precision while I untangled the impossible knot I'd somehow created. You've definitely done this before, I admitted. I'm an engineer. You say that like it's a superpower. He smiled. Sometimes it feels like one. When everything finally worked, we celebrated with takeout from the Thai restaurant around the corner. The evening felt surprisingly ordinary. And somehow, ordinary had become my favorite part. The following afternoon, Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. He had promised to lend me a camera lens for an upcoming project. Noah opened the apartment door. You must be Ryan's roommate. I am. I'm Ethan. They shook hands politely. I joined them moments later. Perfect timing. I figured you'd still be home. We chatted casually while Ethan unpacked the lens from his backpack. Then, as naturally as discussing the weather, he turned toward Noah. So, he grinned at me. Have you finally convinced this stubborn man to let you set him up with another cute guy yet? The room fell completely silent. My heartbeat seemed impossibly loud. Ethan's smile disappeared almost instantly. His eyes widened. Oh, he looked from me to Noah. I didn't know. Neither did Noah. Not officially. I slowly placed the camera lens on the kitchen counter. It's okay. But nothing about the moment felt okay. Ethan muttered a quiet apology before making an excuse to leave. The apartment door clicked shut behind him. Silence remained. Noah stood beside the dining table, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He simply looked distant, as though 1,000 thoughts had arrived at exactly the same time. I should have told you. The words barely rose above a whisper. He looked at me. I figured. You knew? I wondered. I swallowed. I never meant to lie. You didn't. I couldn't finish the sentence. Because every explanation sounded smaller than the truth. I had been afraid. Afraid of losing the first place that had begun to feel like home. Noah lowered his eyes for a brief moment. I need some air. He grabbed his jacket and left before I could respond. The apartment felt strangely enormous after the door closed. I sat alone for nearly an hour. Then another. No messages. No footsteps outside. No sign that he was coming back soon. Eventually, I walked into my bedroom and pulled an empty suitcase from beneath the bed. One shirt. Then another. Sweaters. Jeans. Books. The familiar routine of packing felt painfully automatic. I had done it before. Leaving always became easier after enough practice. Around midnight, the front door opened quietly. I froze. Noah stepped inside carrying nothing except his keys. He noticed the suitcase immediately. His gaze lingered there before meeting mine. Neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say. Because every possible sentence felt too fragile. After several long seconds, Noah finally broke the silence. You don't have to leave tonight. I looked at the half-packed suitcase. I thought that's what you'd want. His shoulders sank almost imperceptibly. I don't know what I want. The honesty in his voice hurt more than anger ever could. He turned toward his bedroom, pausing only once. I'm just asking you. His words came quietly, almost lost in the stillness. To give me a little time. Then the door closed. For the first time since moving into the apartment, I realized the wall between us no longer existed because of fear. It existed because two people who had begun to matter deeply to each other were suddenly standing on opposite sides of a truth neither of them yet knew how to carry. Forgiveness doesn't begin when someone says they're sorry. It begins when they finally tell you the truth they were too afraid to face themselves. The apartment remained unusually quiet for 3 days. Not hostile, not awkward, simply careful. Noah still left a fresh pot of coffee on the kitchen counter every morning. I still washed the dishes before leaving for work. We exchanged polite greetings, asked practical questions, pretended nothing significant had happened. But every conversation ended just before it reached the place both of us were avoiding. The half-packed suitcase stayed beside my bedroom wall, neither unpacked nor carried out the door, a silent reminder that nothing had truly been resolved. Wednesday evening, I arrived home later than usual after finishing a presentation for a demanding client. The apartment lights were dim. The familiar scent of tomato soup drifted from the kitchen. Noah stood at the stove, stirring slowly. He looked exhausted, as though sleep had become optional. You ate? Not yet. I made enough for both of us. For a moment, I considered inventing an excuse. Instead, I nodded. Okay. We carried our bowls to the dining table. For several minutes, only the quiet clink of silverware filled the room. Finally, Noah placed his spoon down. I owe you an explanation. I looked up, but said nothing. He took a slow breath. When my older brother, Daniel, told our family he was gay, I was 19. His eyes remained fixed on the table. I thought I knew exactly what his life should look like. He gave a humorless smile. I thought I was protecting him. The sentence sounded painfully familiar. I argued with him constantly. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bowl. I kept telling him he was making his life harder than it needed to be. I listened quietly. I believed that if he just changed, everything would be easier. His voice cracked for the first time. He stopped talking to me. The room seemed impossibly still. A year later, he was diagnosed with an aggressive illness. Noah swallowed hard. We made peace before he died. He paused, struggling to continue. But forgiveness doesn't erase regret. My chest tightened. I spent years convincing myself that the pain came from who he was. Another silence. It was easier than admitting the pain came from how I treated him. The words settled between us with heartbreaking clarity. I kept saying I hated gay people. He shook his head slowly. The truth is, his voice barely rose above a whisper. I hated the version of myself who failed someone I loved. Neither of us spoke. Outside, rain tapped gently against the apartment windows. Eventually, Noah reached into his jacket pocket. He unfolded an old photograph, the same one I had accidentally found. Daniel stood beside a smiling young Noah on the fishing dock. I carry this because I don't want to forget him. He looked directly at me for the first time all evening. But somewhere along the way, I stopped remembering him. I frowned slightly. I only remembered my guilt. He exhaled slowly. Then you moved in. I waited. You thanked people. You laughed at terrible movies. You called your mother every Sunday. You worried when I worked too late. A faint smile appeared despite everything. You reminded me of someone who deserved kindness. His eyes glistened. And every time I caught myself treating you with basic decency. He laughed quietly through the emotion. I realized my words and my actions no longer belonged to the same person. I felt something inside me soften. I was terrified of telling you the truth. So was I. He glanced toward the suitcase resting against my bedroom doorway. I noticed you started packing. I thought staying would make things worse. It would have. I blinked. He continued before I could misunderstand. Because I would have lost the chance to tell you this. Another long silence passed. This one felt different. Not empty. Healing. Finally, Noah spoke the sentence I never expected to hear. I'm sorry for the man you thought you had to hide from. Without thinking, I stood and crossed the room. I didn't hug him. Not yet. Instead, I rested a hand gently on his shoulder. You aren't that man anymore. For the first time since we met, Noah closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from relief, as though he had finally set down a weight he had been carrying alone for far too many years. The smallest changes are often the ones that quietly rewrite an entire life before anyone realizes the story has become something new. Nothing dramatic happened after Noah apologized. There were no sweeping declarations, no impossible promises, no sudden transformation that erased the past overnight. Instead, life resumed one ordinary morning at a time. Only now, something had shifted. The apartment felt lighter. The silence between us no longer carried uncertainty. It carried comfort. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. I walked into the kitchen expecting to make breakfast. Instead, Noah was already standing by the stove. I remembered you liked blueberry pancakes. I smiled. You remembered that? You've mentioned it 3 times. I didn't realize I had. You also complain every October that coffee gets cold too quickly. I definitely remember saying that. He slid a warm plate toward me. I pay attention. The words were simple. For some reason, they stayed with me long after breakfast ended. Over the following weeks, we settled into a rhythm that no longer required effort. Sometimes we grocery shopped together. Sometimes we spent entire evenings reading separate books in the same room without exchanging more than a few sentences. The quiet never felt empty. It felt shared. One Friday afternoon, Noah surprised me by asking if I wanted to attend the neighborhood street festival. You actually enjoy crowded places? Not particularly. Then why ask? A faint grin appeared. I figured you do. I've never said that. You smile whenever people are around. I laughed. So you've been studying me? I prefer the word noticing. The festival filled several downtown blocks with local musicians, food vendors, handmade crafts, and families enjoying the unusually warm afternoon. Noah remained close enough that we never lost sight of each other in the crowd. Not possessive, simply present. As we waited in line for coffee, 2 men standing behind us began talking loudly. One noticed a couple holding hands across the street. He shook his head with exaggerated disapproval. Everything has to be about them these days. His friend chuckled. Yeah, keep that stuff to yourselves. The words weren't directed at me. They still landed with familiar weight. Instinctively, I looked away. Before I could respond, Noah turned calmly toward the men. They're walking. Both men blinked. What? They're walking. His voice remained steady. They aren't bothering anyone. An awkward silence followed. One of them shrugged dismissively. Whatever. They stepped into another line. Noah turned back toward me as though nothing unusual had happened. You didn't have to do that. Yes. He accepted our coffee cups from the barista. I did. We continued walking without speaking. After several blocks, I finally asked, what changed? He looked ahead for a long moment before answering. I spent years wishing someone had stood beside my brother. The afternoon breeze stirred fallen leaves across the sidewalk. I can't change what I failed to do back then. He handed me my coffee. But I can decide who I become now. The simplicity of the sentence left me unexpectedly emotional. That evening, we returned home carrying leftovers from the festival. While unpacking the bags, Noah pulled 2 movie tickets from his jacket pocket. I almost forgot. You bought these. They're for next weekend. I examined them. A classic film festival. One I'd mentioned wanting to attend months earlier. You remembered. You say that every time. Because you keep surprising me. He leaned casually against the kitchen counter. I'm starting to think surprising you is becoming a habit. Our eyes met. Neither of us looked away. The moment wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncertain. It simply lasted a little longer than either of us intended. Then the kettle began to whistle. We both laughed, grateful for the interruption. Later that night, as I switched off the living room lamp, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I no longer felt grateful simply because Noah accepted me. Somewhere between shared breakfasts, quiet evenings, honest conversations, and small acts of unwavering kindness, acceptance had quietly become affection. And that realization was far more frightening than anything I had ever needed to hide. Love rarely arrives with certainty. More often, it appears as a quiet question you can no longer avoid asking yourself. November arrived with colder mornings and earlier sunsets. The apartment windows fogged whenever Noah brewed coffee before work. I always wiped a small circle in the glass before leaving, just enough to check whether it had snowed overnight. Without discussing it, Noah began wiping the second circle beside mine. A tiny habit, one that somehow meant more than either of us admitted. Life continued to settle into something warm and familiar. We argued about which pizza place deserved to be called the best in Chicago. He insisted on folding laundry the exact same way every week. I insisted his method took twice as long. He claimed precision mattered. I claimed clean clothes didn't care about geometry. Those conversations usually ended with laughter. One Friday evening, we attended the Classic Film Festival together. The theater was nearly full. Old velvet seats creaked whenever someone shifted. The black and white movie unfolded quietly across the screen. Halfway through, I realized I had spent more time watching Noah smile than watching the film itself. He noticed. What? You've missed the last 10 minutes. So have you. I've seen this one before. You never told me. You never asked. His answer came with the smallest smile. After the movie ended, light snow drifted across the sidewalk outside. Neither of us hurried home. Instead, we wandered through nearly empty streets decorated with early holiday lights. The city felt unusually peaceful. I'm glad you came tonight, I said. I almost didn't. Why? He tucked his hands into his coat pockets. I wasn't sure whether you'd say yes. I laughed softly. I've been saying yes to almost everything you ask lately. I noticed. There was that word again. Noticed. He always noticed. We reached the small neighborhood park a few blocks from the apartment. Fresh snow covered the benches in a thin white layer. Without thinking, we sat anyway. For several minutes, we watched people crossing the square. Couples, families, friends, ordinary lives, continuing around us. Finally, Noah spoke. Can I ask you something? Of course. When did you stop being afraid of me? The question caught me off guard. I considered pretending I needed time to think. Instead, I answered honestly. I don't know the exact day. He waited. I think it happened little by little. I smiled faintly. Every time you showed me someone different from the person I expected. He looked down at the snow beneath his shoes. I've been trying to figure something out. What? His next words came slowly, as though each one had been carefully examined before being spoken aloud. I used to think what frightened me most was confronting my past. He lifted his eyes toward mine. But that isn't true. I remained silent. The truth is, he laughed nervously. I've become afraid of losing you. The world around us seemed to grow impossibly still. Even the distant traffic faded beneath the quiet snowfall. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Noah. He shook his head gently. I'm not finished. For the first time since we'd met, uncertainty appeared in his expression. I don't know exactly what this says about me. I've spent weeks trying to explain it away. He smiled to himself. It never works. A slow breath escaped him. When you leave for work, the apartment feels too quiet. When you're late coming home, I keep checking the clock. When something funny happens, you're the first person I want to tell. His voice softened. And somewhere along the way, he looked directly into my eyes. You stopped feeling like my roommate. Neither of us moved. The snow continued falling around us. I reached for his gloved hand. Not quickly, not dramatically, just carefully. Our fingers met. He didn't pull away. Instead, he held my hand with quiet certainty, as though it had always belonged there. No declarations followed. None were necessary. Because sometimes the loudest promise two people can make is choosing not to let go when the moment finally gives them permission to stay. Home isn't the place where your story begins. It's the place where someone quietly chooses to stay, long after they have every reason to leave. Winter settled over Chicago. With gentle confidence, snow softened the rooftops. The trees outside our apartment stood bare against pale morning skies. Inside, however, life felt warmer than ever. Not because everything had become perfect, because perfection had never been the goal. Noah and I never rushed into defining what we were. After that evening in the park, we simply allowed our lives to keep moving in the same direction. Our morning coffee became a shared ritual instead of two separate routines. Weekend grocery trips turned into playful debates over recipes we both pretended to understand. Movie nights ended with conversations that lasted far longer than the films themselves. Somehow, affection had become part of everyday life without either of us forcing it. One Saturday in early December, I unlocked the apartment door after visiting Ethan. Noah looked up from the dining table. "How's Ethan?" "He says he expects an apology." Noah frowned. "For what?" I laughed. "For accidentally introducing us to each other in the most terrifying way possible." A slow smile spread across Noah's face. "Tell him he's forgiven. I think he'll appreciate hearing that." Later that afternoon, we walked through the neighborhood holiday market. Children laughed while chasing one another between decorated stalls. Local musicians played familiar songs beneath strings of golden lights. The air smelled of cinnamon, roasted almonds, and fresh pine. At one booth, volunteers invited visitors to write holiday wishes on small wooden ornaments before hanging them on a community tree. Noah picked up a pen. "What are you writing?" "If I tell you, it won't count." "I'm pretty sure that's not how wishes work. So let me believe it." I watched him tie the ornament onto a branch before stepping aside. When he wandered toward another booth, curiosity won. I walked closer. His handwriting was neat and unmistakable. It read, "Thank you for giving me another chance to become the brother Daniel believed I could be." For a long moment, I simply stood there. The wind stirred the branches gently. I realized then that Noah wasn't trying to erase his past. He was honoring it by living differently. When I caught up with him, I slipped my hand into his. He looked at me with quiet understanding. Neither of us mentioned the ornament. We didn't need to. Several months later, spring sunlight returned to the city. The apartment lease approached its renewal date. One evening, Noah placed the paperwork on the kitchen counter. "We should probably decide." I pretended to study the pages. "Looks complicated." "It isn't." "No." He smiled. "You either stay." He paused just long enough to make me laugh. "Or you stay." So those are my choices. They're the only ones I'm hoping for. I reached for the pen and signed my name. "I think I can live with that." He added his signature beneath mine. Not as a landlord. Not merely as a roommate. As the person building a future beside me. That night, while washing the dinner dishes together, Noah suddenly spoke. "You know what? I'm glad you ignored my worst first impression." I handed him a clean plate. "I'm glad you proved it wasn't the real one." He rested the dish carefully inside the cabinet before turning toward me. "I love you, Ryan." The words arrived without hesitation, without fear, without the weight of guilt that had once shaped every part of his life. I smiled through tears I didn't bother hiding. "I love you too." Outside, the city continued exactly as it always had. Cars passed below our windows. Neighbors carried groceries upstairs. Someone laughed in the courtyard. Ordinary life moved forward. Yet inside our little apartment, everything had changed. The man who once believed hatred could protect him had discovered that compassion required far greater courage. And the man who arrived believing he would have to hide forever had finally found a place where honesty felt as natural as breathing. Sometimes the greatest love story isn't about changing another person. It's about giving them enough kindness that they become brave enough to change themselves. And that, more than anything else, is what finally turned an apartment into our home.